Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. We're broadcast on Great Plains Television, that's channel 26.1, Sunday mornings at 8:30 and repeated that afternoon at 4:30. Also on my site, The Voice for Liberty, that's at wichitaliberty.org. There you can find this episode of Wichita Liberty TV, all the past episodes, show notes about today's episodes, and lots of other material, as I think most of you know. Today, we have a special guest, Ben Jones. He is campaign strategist for Equal Justice USA and works in support of conservatives concerned about the death penalty, which is a project of Equal Justice USA. He received his PhD in political science from Yale University, and he lives in Lawrence, Kansas. So, Ben, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV.
Thanks for having me, Rob.
And I should mention that our co-host, Carl Peterjohn, is taking this week off. So, death penalty is an emotional issue for a lot of people on both sides of the issue, I think. How did you become interested in this issue?
Well, I grew up supporting the death penalty. Mm-hmm. So I was, my family did. It was just sort of the automatic position one had. And really I started learning about how this gets applied in reality. And as I looked at how it gets carried out, especially the mistakes that government makes in terms of wrongful convictions, I really started questioning, should we be giving government this power? And so that was sort of my personal evolution on the issue, and eventually coming to oppose it. And then I really got involved when I was in graduate school. There were, at the time, Connecticut had the death penalty. And I got involved with a local organization there, the Connecticut Network to Abolish the Death Penalty, and worked there for 3.5 years, and were able to get a bill passed ending the death penalty. Mm-hmm. And so ever since have been very passionate about this issue and continuing to work on it.
And what is the state of the law today here in Kansas regarding the death penalty?
Kansas has the death penalty. It reinstated it in 1994. Mm-hmm. So it's about 2 decades that it's had the death penalty under the current law. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the death penalty nationwide, you see there are some states that don't have the death penalty at all, and then among the states that have it, there are some that use it with some frequency, states like Texas and Missouri. And then there are other states where it's on the books, but it doesn't get used very often, and Kansas is definitely in that latter category.
Because we do have, about a dozen or so people on that have been sentenced to death, but no one's actually been killed yet.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Are any of the prisoners close to being perhaps executed?
From my conversations with different lawyers in Kansas, no one thinks it's particularly imminent an execution in the state. So we're still, 5 or so years off at least before an execution could come
And I think that's because the legal system is really, I don't want to say stacked, but it does have a lot of protections for the condemned prisoners. There's many avenues of appeal. The Carr brothers in Kansas, of course, are kind of a notorious example of their death penalty being overturned a year or two ago by the Kansas Supreme Court. And their crimes were committed, I think, in 1990, I think. So
I think 2000.
2000, yeah. You're right. That's still been 16 or 17 years ago. So, yeah. In Kansas, there has been a bill this year, you mentioned to me, that would have abolished the death penalty. What did that bill provide for?
So that bill is pretty straightforward. It would have repealed the death penalty prospectively, so after the date of the bill's enactment moving forward, and would have replaced the death penalty with life in prison without parole. So it's, the idea is we don't want these people to get out. They need, they committed horrific crimes, need to stay in there. But it would get rid of the death penalty, and it's an interesting issue because you find a broad spectrum of folks that work together against the death penalty. So in terms of the bill sponsors, there were some very conservative Republicans, folks like Representative Bill Sutton, and then moderate Republicans, Democrats, all joining together on the bill. And you see people come to this issue from a variety of different perspectives. I mean, one thing that gets brought up a lot is, Kansas has had the death penalty since 1994. We haven't used it at all, and studies have shown it's very costly for the state. And so, I know one of our sponsors, Representative Sutton, one of the things he says, and he testified for the bill, is when you're trying to cut government programs and cut government spending, sometimes those are difficult decisions. There are certain benefits that we're getting from programs, and you'd lose those benefits if you get rid of them. And he's like, with the death penalty, this is one of the easier choices, because this is something that has provided zero utility. I mean, we haven't used it at all since reinstating it.
Well, I was listening to the radio the other morning, a local talk show here, and the death penalty was a topic for a segment, and a caller said, well, we've got it, we better use it or we might lose it. So that was his argument in favor of the death penalty. But we're going to take a moment off, but I want to ask you, what happened to that bill in the Kansas legislature? What are the prospects for future passage? So I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. My guest this week, Ben Jones with Equal Justice USA, and we're talking about the death penalty. So you mentioned that there are both conservatives and liberals that are joining together in some cases to oppose the death penalty. For conservatives, it's often, like you mentioned, a financial issue, that the death penalty is very expensive. Is that because the prisoners are expensive to house, or is it because of all the legal appeals, do you think?
It's mostly on the legal side of it. Incarcerating someone either in administrative segregation or on death row usually is more costly, but the bulk of the costs come in the legal process. And that's not just the case in Kansas. I mean, there have been studies about the cost of the death penalty in a variety of different states, and time again, they come back showing that it's more costly than life in prison without parole. And the main reason for that is that so if you look at the death penalty's history in the United States, it was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1972, so across the nation.
And what was their reason for that?
It was a close 5-4 decision, and it said that the death penalty, it didn't say that per se the death penalty is unconstitutional, but the way it was being applied. And
was
so,
cruel and unusual,
yeah.
Is that, and that's the fifth?
Eighth Amendment.
Eighth Amendment, okay.
And there was one Justice Potter, put it that the death penalty was cruel and unusual in the same way that being struck by lightning was cruel and unusual. It's arbitrary, it's capricious, and in fact, when you look at how it was applied prior to that ruling, there were a lot of problems with it. You could still get the death penalty for rape, and what you found was 90% of those who got the death penalty for rape were African Americans convicted of raping white women. And if you were white and committed rape, hardly ever got the death penalty. So there were these disparities, arbitrary way it was applied. And so the court, seeing this, said, you can't carry out the death penalty this way. This was a violation of the Eighth Amendment. And so what a lot of states did was they rewrote their statutes to try to provide more discretion or more guidance to juries in making these decisions of who gets the death penalty and who doesn't. And so 4 years later, in Gregg v. Georgia, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that you could have the death penalty. But they stipulated, laws had to have certain features in them. And one of the things that the Supreme Court said is that you couldn't have a mandatory death penalty, and that you had to consider both mitigating and aggravating factors. And it's this decision by the court where we see this system evolve that has proven to be incredibly costly. And, when lawyers have to prepare for a capital case, it's not just, is this person guilty or not, but is this one of the worst crimes? And what the defense has to do is essentially write the biography for a defendant. And so, some of the mitigating factors that could be raised is, this person committed a horrific murder, but maybe they were a veteran who had PTSD and that didn't get treated. And I think a lot of folks in this country, they may support the death penalty, but someone like that, should we be executing military veterans with PTSD? A lot of people are uncomfortable with that. And so these are some of the factors that could be raised during the second phase of the trial, the sentencing phase. And preparing for that is very costly. It extends the length of the trial. And when you have more lawyers working for a longer period of time, it's going to cost more money.
Is the sentencing phase, is that something that came out of the Supreme Court decision? Is that something that satisfied the court as
Right.
to what would make the death penalty at least pass constitutional muster in their view? Yeah, so, and I think some of the appeals in Kansas have been just attacking the sentencing phase, not the underlying guilt or innocence of the criminal, but the sentencing phase. So, yeah. So, you said the bill had a hearing in the committee of the House of Representatives, and what happened after that?
Well, we had a great hearing. There were, I believe, 27 proponents for the bill. This is to repeal the death penalty, replace it with life in prison without parole. 3 opponents. And a variety of different folks testified. I mentioned Representative Sutton, a Republican legislator. There were victims' family members who testified. One of them was a woman named Celeste Dixon. And she lives in Larned, Kansas. She's a Kansan. But her mother was murdered in Texas.
Okay.
And in Texas, it sought the death penalty, and the person eventually was executed. And she had a very powerful story because she came before the committee and said, I still waited over 20 years for this execution. And, anywhere you look in this country, this doesn't go quickly. And so when a death sentence is sought, victims' family members are a lot of times stuck in this legal process for years or decades, and that can be a very painful process to go through. And so, she shared her concerns and said, this isn't helping victims' family members how this process works here in Kansas.
And so then the bill, was it approved by the committee? Or?
So the committee put off voting on it this year. It's a 2-year session, so we'll have to see, based on our conversations, seemed to be strong support among the members. It's obviously up to the chair whether or not he wants to vote on it the second year of this session.
And sometimes, I think it's kind of hard to get traction and attention for some of these bills like this because we've got the school finance and the budget and the taxes and issues that, I'm not saying the death penalty bill is not important, but...
you have to have a budget. You take care of that
and
first.
like you said, no one's in imminent danger of being executed right now this year. So I guess that, I think we've learned that legislatures, if it's possible to put something off, they're going to do that. So when we come back, I want to ask Ben Jones about what are some of the arguments people use in favor of the death penalty and why are these not necessarily good arguments? Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with Ben Jones of Equal Justice USA and talking about the death penalty. So a week or two ago, I put up a story on my website about the death penalty. It was just a repeat, I think, of a press release from a year or two ago about a group that was opposed to the death penalty. And boy, things like this just get hundreds of comments, very passionate one. Let me just present a few. One person addressing me said, "You don't think Dennis Rader and the Carr brothers deserve the death penalty?" So a lot of people believe that there are some crimes so heinous, that some criminals are so monstrous and evil, that death is really the only penalty severe enough to satisfy their need for justice.
And I can definitely understand that sentiment. I mean, there are horrific crimes that happen here in Kansas, across the nation, and I can understand why some people come to the conclusion that certain people deserve to die. There are other folks, for faith reason or other reasons, they disagree with that, and I can understand, that debate. But it's not just do these people deserve to die, but do we trust government to carry out this policy? And that's an additional hurdle that we have to meet if we're going to carry out the death penalty.
Because we know that there have been mistakes in the past. We know a friend of ours, Floyd Bledsoe, although he was not convicted, or he was convicted of murder or what exactly, not sentenced to death, but nonetheless he spent 16 or so years in prison before being exonerated, and exonerated because of DNA evidence. So that's another thing a lot of people say, well, Bob, if we have proof by DNA, or some people say, like, a whole busload of nuns as eyewitnesses, or something like that.
I haven't seen a murder like that before, but maybe.
Well, first of all, I think from some of the reading I've done, eyewitness testimony is very unreliable.
Right.
And then DNA, I think the science behind that is settled that the odds of two people having an identical DNA profile is like in the trillions or something like that. But the system is still run by humans. Humans collect the DNA, humans run the tests, humans interpret the tests, and there's still a huge potential for human error, even though we're talking about DNA evidence.
Right. I mean, DNA is an incredible tool, and it's helped law enforcement solve crimes. It's helped free innocent people like Floyd Bledsoe. But it's important to recognize the limitations of DNA. I think people, they watch CSI, they watch these crime shows and think, well, after an hour, we're going to know who the bad guys are.
Sure.
And that's not how it works in reality. The estimates are only 5 to 10% of criminal cases have DNA. So there's, the vast majority of cases, we don't have this, hard scientific evidence available. And so we're still relying on eyewitness testimony, other forms of evidence that aren't as foolproof. And then also, as you mentioned, there's always the risk of human error, or even worse, abuse by officials.
And I think my guest last week that Keen Umber, has a lot of experience with the criminal justice system in Kansas. He knows of a number of cases, such as Dana Chandler in Topeka, where the prosecutor deliberately lied to the court about evidence in order to make her case because, I don't know, she had political ambitions, or, lawyers want to win typically on both sides, and sometimes, unfortunately, prosecutors step over the line and behave unethically and even illegally in making their cases.
Right. And think about it. If you're charged with a crime, your life is on the line, and let's say there's evidence out there that shows you're innocent, but law enforcement has that, prosecutor has it, and they suppress it at trial. And this has happened numerous times.
Now, the law says they have to provide that.
The law says that they have to, but they don't always do it.
Right.
And if it's suppressed, how can you prove your innocence if you don't have access to that evidence? And, just a few cases just to sort of illustrate this problem. There was one case not too far from here in Oklahoma City. There is a police forensic chemist named Joyce Gilmour who worked with law enforcement, and she was getting all these awards. She was solving these crimes that no one else could solve. And the reason why, she was making up the evidence. She was tampering with it, fabricating the evidence, and it led to innocent people being sent to prison, including to death row. And so you have cases like this. In Texas, there's another case, a guy named Michael Morden. It was a murder case. He didn't end up on death row, but he was sent away, was in prison for 25 years, nearly 25 years. And finally, DNA exonerated him. At trial, the prosecutor had suppressed evidence. And what the consequences for the prosecutor is he ended up spending 10 days in jail.
10 days.
10 days.
Well, even that is remarkable, because in a lot of these cases, nothing ever happens against the prosecutors. Keen was very clear about that, too. So, a lot of mistakes there. Judges, we have a case here in Sedgwick County Court where a judge fell asleep during his conduct or his oversight of a trial, and I think the Supreme Court ruled that it wasn't a material factor in the outcome of the case. But judges are not perfect either, I think. So we've got scientific stuff, but then we've got humans mingling in and all sorts of probability for errors. So let's take another moment off for a commercial break, and when we come back, we'll finish up this week of Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to this last segment of Wichita Liberty TV for this week. I'm Bob Weeks with my guest Ben Jones of Equal Justice USA. One of the issues that's always involved with the criminal justice system, and especially with the death penalty, is the family, relatives, friends, whatever, of the victim. And some people, returning back to what people left on Facebook, capital punishment is the right of the family of the murder victim they loved and was taken from them willfully by the loving murderer, and that justifies the death penalty. That sounds like revenge to me, which of course is a natural human instinct. But should the friends and family of a victim have really anything to do with the punishment that a criminal eventually receives?
I mean, it's one thing to point out is the complications and reality of even trying to carry out this proposal. So, when you talk to murder victims' family members, you'll find some support the death penalty, some are against it, and some don't have a strong opinion one way or the other. Mm-hmm. And you find those divisions within families themselves. And so if you have someone who's murdered and the mother wants one penalty but the daughter wants another, I mean, how do you decide that? Mm-hmm. And another issue too is that these decisions are made at the very beginning, right after the murder, and obviously people are angry, mm-hmm. but you also have to look at what's this entire process going to look like. And so, after 20 years, are people still going to want to be stuck in the legal system? And that's the reality of the death penalty. And I think sometimes that's not always, fully explained and understood of like, this is what the system, this is what the system's going to look like. Now, some still favor the death penalty, but at the end of the day, just saying, we'll let the victim's family members decide, that's not easy to carry out because you'll find divisions even within families.
And I guess some people are looking for, the friends and families of victim are looking for closure, and they see if the person is executed, that's closure. But as we found out, that closure, if it happens, may not happen for 10, 15, 20 or more years. If someone is sentenced to life without possibility of parole, or even something like a hard 40 or 50 sentence, that can happen pretty quickly, and after that, there's really not the endless round of appeals. Is that right?
Right. I mean, there are still some appeals, mm-hmm. and obviously, if evidence of innocence comes out, that can be brought forward. But the appeals process in capital cases is much more complex than in a non-capital case, mm-hmm. and so and they're also overturned at a higher rate. Mm-hmm. So it's more likely if you get a death sentence for it to be overturned than for the end result to be an execution. Mm-hmm. And so you don't have that same uncertainty if the death penalty is not sought.
Yeah. And I think in Kansas we do have this hard 40 or hard 50 sentence that's available. Is that about as good as life in prison, or is it not good enough for some people still?
I mean, from my understanding, there's not parole. You're going to be there for that time, mm-hmm. But we also, life without parole is also an option. Mm-hmm. And we have that, we've used it, and, these people aren't getting out.
Mm-hmm. And some people will say, well, that's being soft on crime, and they worry about the deterrent effect of the death penalty, that they believe that deters criminals. And I don't know, I haven't killed anybody because of the death penalty or not. I mean, I don't kill people for other reasons. What is the evidence on deterrence? Do we know anything about that?
Yeah, there have been a lot of studies on the death penalty and whether or not it has a deterrence effect. And probably the most helpful place to go is the National Academy of Sciences did a meta-analysis. So they looked at all these different studies on deterrence and said, okay, what can we conclude from all these different studies? And after this analysis, their conclusion was, there's no evidence the death penalty impacts murder rates one way or the other. Mm-hmm. And so we're spending all this money, because law enforcement dollars, it's a limited resource. Yeah. And so are we going to spend all this money on something that there's no proven record that it's making us safer, or are we going to put it towards more evidence-based programs?
And some people have brought up the death penalty helps the safety of correctional officers and other inmates in the prison. That is, someone sentenced to a very long term or even to life, if they misbehave in prison and kill somebody, then they still have another penalty they could receive. But if they're life without parole, they've got as much penalty as it's possible to have. Does that make any sense? Or?
Yeah, I hear this argument a lot, and the problem is that the data just aren't there to back it up. And so I was, because people were making this argument, I was looking at murders of corrections officials by inmates in the United States. And fortunately, that doesn't happen too often. Like nationwide, you see around 3 or so a year. So, I mean, that's still too many, but fortunately, this isn't a very frequent occurrence. And when you look at, where these murders happened, they've disproportionately happened in states with the death penalty.
I see.
So this idea that it's having a deterrent effect, there's not a lot of evidence for it. And furthermore, we don't have summary executions in the United States. So even if someone gets sentenced to death, you have to keep them on death row for a period of time while they go through the legal process.
The system.
And when you talk to corrections officers, they have procedures and systems in place to make sure those people don't harm again. And if you want to keep prisons safer, make sure they have the proper staffing and resources to do their job. Death penalty doesn't do much.
In just the moment we have left, Ben, if people want to learn more about this issue or get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
So they can go to either ejusa.org or conservativesconcerned.org. And then also here in Kansas, a group that's active is the Kansas Coalition Against the Death Penalty, which is kansasabolition.org.
And I'll be sure to put links to those organizations in the show notes for today's episode. But other than that, Ben, we're out of time. So thanks very much for traveling down to Wichita to appear on Wichita Liberty TV to talk about this important issue. And I'm Bob Weeks, and we'll be back again next week. Thank you for watching.